Hey everybody, this week's question is a good one, and it's one that really is trying to address a narrative in our culture that's very, very pervasive. It's very popular, and it's about self-love. So the question is, do I need to love myself more? And I think the short answer that I want to give is no. But I want to flesh that out. And I'm going to start with the same place that John Piper starts his answer to this question, and it's with the command in the Bible that appears both in the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Paul, that the whole law is fulfilled in one word: love your neighbor as yourself. So I think one could certainly understand that or interpret it by saying, look, the Bible says that we need to love ourselves. But if you look closer at the way Jesus articulates that command, or if you look closer at the way Paul does here in Galatians chapter 5, what it says is that it gives the imperative for us to love our neighbors. The command is not to love ourselves. The command is to love our neighbors and to love them as ourselves, similar to the golden rule. As we would have others do unto us, so we ought to do to others. And of course, what I think Jesus is tapping into here is that in order to rightly direct our loves, we need to deflect it away from the self. He assumes that we love ourselves. He assumes that we'll be self-centered, we'll be geared in our sinful condition toward inward thinking, toward looking out for ourselves, looking out for our own self-interest. And I think what's so key about this is that in order to do the first and greatest commandment according to Jesus, which is to love the Lord your God with all of our hearts, not most of our hearts, the parts of our hearts that aren't infatuated with ourselves. No, all of our heart, and love your neighbor as yourself, which I think is a horizontal expression of the vertical reality of our relationship and love that we have for God. And I think what I desire to do in my ministry, what I hope most faithful pastors are doing in their ministries, is to aim by opening up the scriptures to people, to help people fall out of love with themselves and to fall into deeper love with Christ. And I was struck by something that Calvin said when he said, it's of no slight importance for you to be cleansed of your blind love of self. Why? That you may be made more nearly aware of your incapacity, to feel your own incapacity, that you may learn to distrust yourself, that you may transfer your trust to God, to rest with a trustful heart in God, that relying upon his help, you may persevere unconquered to the end, to take your stand in his grace, that you may comprehend the truth of his promises, to have unquestioned certainty of his promises, that your hope may thereby be strengthened. It's a wonderful quote, that we empty ourselves of our instinct to trust, to love, to look out for ourselves all the time, and to turn it outward by filling ourselves with trust and love and affection for God. And that'll spill over into love and affection for others. And I love the one word in there that Calvin describes of self-love, and he calls it blind love of self. And I think Jesus assumes the same thing, that we wake up in the morning geared to love ourselves. And what this doesn't mean, what Calvin isn't telling us to stay away from, is to acknowledge our dignity, to acknowledge the beauty of the self, to acknowledge the beauty of humanity. And this is tracing back to the doctrine of the image of God, where God created humanity in his image with an inherent dignity, with a destiny to face him, on the last day, and to have dominion over creation, to see that there's a value inherent to every single human life as we bear God's image and reflect his creative glory. And so much sin in the world, so much injustice stems from losing sight of the doctrine of the image of God. Sin like abortion, that removes the inherent right to life of a human being, depending on where they're located, inside the womb or outside the womb. Or to say that a life in utero is of less dignity or value or destiny than a life out of the womb. Racism is a sin there's an overflow from failing to acknowledge and pursue love for other image-bearing human beings. It's to see somebody for the way that they look or the way that they express themselves as a lesser existence than a different person who also bears the image of God is an atrocity. The doctrine of the image of God, I think, is why a failure to see the doctrine of the image of God, I think, is also where sins like murder and suicide stem from. Is failure to see the inherent value of the self and to end your own life, or the sin of murder where you fail to see the value, dignity, and beauty in someone else and you take their life. So Jesus, there's no command in the Bible to love yourself. The command is to love the Lord your God with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself, and it's in these commandments that the whole law is fulfilled. Now, one thing that Tim Keller has really helped me with in thinking through this whole thing about self-love and the idolatry of the self and the sin of pride is to think about how pride manifests itself. And there's a sermon that he has that I would commend to each and every one of you called "The Man That the King Delights to Honor." The Man the King Delights to Honor. And it's a sermon on the biblical character of Haman. And Keller kind of says that Haman is the sort of embodiment. He's the prototypical example of pride in the Bible. And what's so interesting is that Keller points out that there's two main ways that pride can manifest itself in our lives. And the first and most obvious way is superiority pride, where we believe that we are superior to others, where we deserve a better outcome in our lives than other people, and then we end up putting others down as a result of a elevated self-view, a self-love that manifests itself in pride. But the other manifestation of pride, which this is the thing about the sermon that I found so brilliant, is inferiority pride, where you're always viewing yourself as lesser than others, whether it's a body image thing, or whether it's a financial self-image that's inferior to others, or it's a power hunger, and you see others as superior to yourself with regards to how much power they have, or academic inferiority pride. And the reason Keller thinks that they're both pride, and I think he's absolutely right, and I think he's getting this idea from C.S. Lewis and others, but it's because pride is always to see the self in relation to others. And Keller's brilliant line that he has and he doesn't have a book with this title, is the freedom of self-forgetfulness, where he says that humility is not so much of thinking less of yourself, which is really just inferiority pride, but to think of the self less. And this is what's so brilliant. And this is why I don't think we should devote ourselves to loving the self. But Keller says true humility, which I think manifests itself in love for God and others, is one that thinks little of the self, thinks of the self not very often. Because the truly humble person, when you meet them, is somebody who's just obviously fascinated with you. You don't think, this person is vocally self-abasing. You don't think that they're constantly talking themselves down. But rather, when you meet a truly humble person, there's somebody who's absolutely fascinated in you. And so I would say we shouldn't devote ourselves to self-love, but we should devote ourselves to self-forgetfulness. And how do you do that? Well, it's throwing yourselves into these commandments of Jesus, to love the Lord your God with all of your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself. I was talking to somebody this week in YA, and I was just saying to him that one of the most challenging verses in the Bible is one that appears in Romans 12. I can't remember which verse it is, but basically what it says is that we are to rejoice with those who rejoice and to weep with those who weep. Now, the reason that I know that I am geared naturally towards self-love is because whenever I read that commandment, I get uncomfortable. I don't like it. And I think the reason that I don't like it is because I have a natural inclination. Maybe this is just me. I doubt it. But I have a natural inclination to react like this. When somebody that's around me, maybe it's another pastor, or it's another person in general, but I think for me, pastoral ministry is the way this manifests itself. Or when something good happens to another pastor, when they gain notoriety, or one of the other pastors on staff gets asked to preach, my initial inclination is oftentimes envy. It's oftentimes frustration. Why didn't that opportunity come my way? And I think what's even more sinister is when other people in my circles, when something devastating happens to them, my initial gut instinct is not to weep with them, but it's to think, oh man, I have a little bit of a leg up on this person. It's because I'm so naturally self-inclined. I'm oftentimes wired to think, what's the best outcome for me? What's going to help me ascend the ladder of significance, or ascend the ladder of notoriety, or whatever it might be? So I would say to throw yourself at these commandments of Jesus. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart, to love your neighbor as yourself. Love them according to the naturally wired self-love that you already have. And to rejoice with those who rejoice. Work toward this. Pray to this end. And to weep with those who weep. And I think the way to do this is not to muster up your own strength, or to cultivate merits of loving others and loving God, but rather it's to cast your mind to Calvary, where you see Jesus weeping with the women of Jerusalem on his way to the cross. It's to see Jesus weeping with Martha and Mary over their dead brother. It's to see Jesus sweating drops of blood and crying in the garden as he prepares to bear our sins. And it's to see Jesus always loving others, always seeing Jesus love the Lord his God with all of our hearts. Because if we throw our faith in him, if we collapse into his loving arms, God sees us with the love of Christ. We are loved by him, and therefore it spills over into love for others. And by no means saying to cultivate a self-hatred. I'm commending reminding yourselves of, and myself, of the dignity and destiny we have as image bearers, which will prevent sin in our lives, but even more so to cast your mind to Calvary, to set your mind on things that are above, and it will translate, as it's applied through prayer and communion with the people of God and time spent in his word, into a genuine humility, which is not so much thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share this week. I would value your questions. You can comment below the video. You can send me a direct message or an email, or you can send a text to the number provided in the video, in the post. Grace and peace to you all. Looking forward to seeing you at the beach this week.